Hello and welcome to the two-session special of Dialogue, Agenda for Progress. Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang held a virtual press conference on Sunday on the sidelines of the fourth session of the 13th NPC. In about 100 minutes, he answered 27 questions on China's foreign policy and external relations. So how did Wang characterize China's diplomacy in 2020 and the outlook for 2021? Will China-U.S. relations see improvement in the future? And how will Beijing engage in global governance? To talk about those issues and more, I'm joined by Professor Da Wei from the Center for International Strategy and Security at Tsinghua University and Michael O'Hanlon, Senior Fellow and Director of Research of the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings Institutions. That's our topic. I'm Zhou Yue. So let me start with you, Da Wei. What is your impression of Foreign Minister Wang's press conference? And what is your major takeaway of his message?
Yeah, I think for me, I'm an observer of China-U.S. relations. I think there were two questions caught my attention a lot. One was the first question he took. That was about a summary of China's diplomacy in 2020 in the year 2020. That was, of course, it's not an easy year for everyone. It's not easy for China. Wang Yi used, I think, five the most to summarize. He said the most outstanding is the head of state diplomacy, and he said the most resolute is the determination to defend national interest. And he said the most demanding is fighting the COVID-19. And he said the most concerning is the safety of Chinese national abroad. And the last point, he said the biggest priority is advancing global governance. So he used those 5 sentences to summarize the whole year's diplomacy of China. It's very clear and quite touching. The other question caught my attention particularly was China-U.S. relations. I think one thing very important, he emphasized competition and the cooperation. Of course, China always emphasized cooperation, but it's not very easy for Chinese, particularly a Chinese senior official, to say, yeah, we are competitor. Of course, Minister Wang didn't say we are competitor, but he said China and the U.S. are two very important economies. So the two countries do have the relations there. We do have some competitive elements in the relationship. And he said that's normal. And the most important thing is we need a healthy competition on a fair and just basis. I think this expression is very helpful, and it's also important to lay a foundation for the future China-U.S. relations for competition plus cooperation.
And Michael, what do you make of Mr. Wang's tone at the press conference?
Well, I agree with my friend Da Wei that we need to normalize the concept of competition. The United States and China are two incredible powers in every sense of the word. And we do cooperate, and we must cooperate, but we also have different systems of governance and economics, and we're both fairly committed to our own, and we both believe our own concepts may be more useful to other countries. So we are in competition, but that's okay. The important thing is that it not become a path to war or to military arms racing, and that we keep our competition within certain parameters. So I welcome this kind of language. I think it is actually helpful. It's unsentimental. Americans and Chinese can be friends. We are friends. I'm friends with my colleague Da Wei and many other Chinese scholars, but we also can recognize our countries are in a different kind of relationship than the very easy period, let's say, of, I don't know, the 1980s. But of course, there really never was an easy period, because we always had something that would come up that would make even those earlier times more complicated for a period. So now we're just recognizing that we're in a more complex interrelationship. And the key is to find ways to compete constructively and challenge each other sometimes and be resolute in defense of our own core interests, as Jim Steinberg and I wrote in our book 7 years ago when we discussed the U.S.-China relationship. So to me, this kind of language is perfectly acceptable. In fact, it's even desirable because it is realistic. So in that sense, I'm a supporter of the use of language today.
Let's look at the reality in 2020. Well, Washington has practiced sanctions on multiple fronts: the investigation origin of the COVID-19, Hong Kong national security law, supply chain and investment decoupling, and the Xinjiang human rights issues. How would you evaluate the response from Beijing, Dawei?
I think I will say Beijing's response was okay. I will even say was good, because facing Trump administration's sanctions and those harsh measures, I think it's very easy to fall in the trap of tit for tat. But I think Beijing did not took tit for tat tactic against the Trump administration. Of course, necessary retaliation has been made, and sometimes you can hear very harsh rhetoric from officials, from spokesperson. But if we look at, for example, the so-called trade war, the U.S. imposed more sanctions on China, and the U.S. did a lot of things, but China did not retaliate on an equal footing. So and also China did not just focus on the Trump administration. I think China negotiate with the neighboring country, for instance, and and signed the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and also worked with the European partners and to sign a very important investment protection treaty. I think those are very smart measures.
Michael, have the foreign policy establishment in D.C. done some soul searching about China policy in 2020? What might be adjusted in 2021?
Well, that's a big question, as you know. We have a new president, to say the least. And we also know that even though President Trump was a very disruptive American leader, he did in some ways channel and express a frustration with the state of U.S.-China relations that's very bipartisan. Now, Mr. Trump did not really chart a path forward that most of us would support, but his frustration with the previous relationship and his recognition that it needs to change and that America's strategy towards China needs to change, I think that's widely agreed. So at a broad conceptual level, there's nothing more pressing for Joe Biden as president than to rethink how to work on the U.S.-China partnership and also competition, and how to explain that to the American people. So my own view is we need to be very clear about certain core interests, such as access to the South China Sea and defense of our key allies, and the non-use of force to settle disputes. But we also need to expect a long-term competition of different economic and political models. And in a good case, the two countries can actually push each other to do better, because competition can be a good thing. And it can force each side to essentially try to show why its own model may be better. As long as that happens in a context of transparency and stability and peace, I think we'll be okay. So the U.S.-China relationship is more complex than it's been in probably 40 or 45 years, but it doesn't have to be bad. It's just going to be more complicated. And I think it'll be more complicated for all of our lives and our children's lives. But if we're fortunate, the United States and China will wind up achieving cooperative ventures where they can actually work together and minimize those areas of disagreement. Let's say, for example, over Taiwan, where we just have to make sure that we don't use force, that no one uses force, that the issue is addressed in non-military ways. And if we can find a way to move forward on that basis, I think we'll be okay.
Okay. Dawei, I want you to respond to what Michael just said. The U.S. core interest is access to the South China Sea and the peaceful settlement of disputes. I think he refers to the Taiwan issue.
Yeah, I think I don't know if all the American colleagues use that term as my friend Michael used, the core interest, because this is usually being viewed as a Chinese term. But yes, some of my American friends use that word, and some of them say vital interest. No matter what term you use, I think access to the high sea and access to for instance, to a market, and I think this is one of the vital or core interests of the U.S. And actually, I don't think we have conflict over the general principle of that. But the problem, the devil is in the detail. I think because where, for instance, in South China Sea, can the U.S. have the access, and where the U.S. cannot, we have China and the U.S. have different views, and so I think our conflict is not over those principles, but our conflict is over the details. But this means our conflict is not a principal conflict. I think our principal differences. This is something we can negotiate. This is something we can talk. China does not oppose the U.S. Or any country's legal right to enter a high sea. Of course, China have that right too.
But Michael, in his speech or in his answer to the press, Foreign Minister Wang Yi resolutely affirmed the position that Taiwan is part of China. This is the bottom line. America should be very clear about this. We do not rule out the possibility of reuniting Taiwan with force if necessary. So this hasn't changed at all for the past few decades. Why Americans are concerned about whether it can still be a challenge?
Well, you're asking us tonight to address the relationship from first principles, and to talk about the Biden administration and how it's going to think about China. And so what I'm trying to do is, from an American strategist point of view, to express my worst case worries and how we have to avoid seeing those come to being. So that's why I bring up Taiwan, and that's why I bring up the South China Sea, because I don't see a whole lot of other issues where the United States and China would actually come up to the brink of conflict with each other. But those two, we have to work very hard to manage. And I understand that Taiwan, in some sense, is Chinese. If we think historically, if we think culturally, if we think in terms of human relationships, I hope that there can someday be a concept that Taiwan and China figure out together that may not be exactly reunification, but it also may be some kind of broader affiliation or commonwealth. I don't know. It's not my job to figure that out, and Chinese don't want Americans to figure that out for you. So again, I think that as an American, I need to understand that people in Taiwan and China want to figure this out on their own. And that's the way it should be. The only American interest is that a longstanding friend in Taiwan have some role in that conversation and not be militarily pressured into a decision that it finds, unpromising for its own future. And that raises the difficult question that what if China got tired of waiting, or if some other cause led to a conflict? And of course, we all know at that point, then it's very hard to predict the future. That's the scary thing. It depends on how a conflict would begin. It depends on what kinds of military options would present themselves to each side. By the way, I'm a military specialist, and a war over Taiwan is a very complicated thing. It's not obvious who would win, and it's not obvious what winning would even mean. So I think both sides have to be very, very sober about the idea that they somehow would have the upper hand in a conflict over Taiwan. So it scares me because it's one of the only issues where I think there is a possibility of direct US-China military combat. Otherwise, I believe our two countries are smart enough and sufficiently aware of their common interests to avoid war. We don't have any issues between us that require combat. And one of the few where I could imagine a process getting out of control is Taiwan. In fact, that may be about the only issue, apart from the South China Sea, where I do believe, and I will say it again, as I often have on CGTN, that I do believe China is going to have to acknowledge that all countries have the right to use the South China Sea for commerce and for military passage. And this is just not a place where the 9-dash line can be interpreted to imply any kind of Chinese control or ownership. I feel very strongly about that and want to say it very clearly. Those two issues, and then the possibility of a Korea conflict getting out of control, those are probably the only three things that really keep me up at night in the US-China strategic relationship, because they all have the possibility, however remote.
And you're now watching Dialogue's two-session special, Agenda for Progress. We'll take a short break and be back in a minute. Let's talk about the cooperative part. Do you think what issues might bring the two sides closer and more unwilling to be drawn into conflict? For example, is it COVID, vaccine cooperation, climate change, trade? What might be the breakthrough point? Michael?
Well, let's start with COVID. And let's not get into the issue of how it began. That's a separate conversation. That's an important conversation. But you asked about cooperation. I'm all in favor of both China and the United States developing vaccines, manufacturing as many as they can, and let's have a healthy competition to see who can help other countries the most, the fastest, because the world needs COVID relief. This is an area where competition can push us all to do better, just like in the Olympics. In Japan this summer and in China next year, competition can bring out the best in people. And on this issue, the beneficiaries are all around the world, 7.5 billion people. So I hope the Chinese vaccine works. I hope the American vaccines and European vaccines work. And if we want to have a competition to see who can save the most lives, that's good. You know, we should be transparent, we should be ethical, we should be scientific, but let's compete, because the world will benefit if we all try to make as many safe vaccines that are effective as possible. So that's a good example. Thank you for asking.
What about climate change? What exactly can the two sides do together? Do they have enough trust to use each other's technologies?
Climate may be more complicated in some ways because it's less obvious how we solve it in the near to medium term. On the issue of using each other's technologies, we do get into questions of intellectual property rights. Yeah. And as you know, that's one of the more complicated matters in US-China relations. But if both sides develop their own technologies sort of fair and square, and then have a competition over who can produce the most efficient and economical ways of, let's say, turning solar energy into electricity, that's good too. And as an American, I don't mind losing the competition to China if the whole world will benefit. If the competition itself pushes us both to produce better things faster. And let's say China is a little better, a little faster, but we're still good, that's a positive outcome. So on that one, as an American, I don't feel the need to beat China or somehow maintain superiority. Again, that's where healthy competition can be productive for all of us. But I think, you know, we're all facing a challenge because both sides are still using too much oil. And on this issue, both China and the United States are part of the problem. We're not just part of the solution.
Exactly.
So we're going to have to keep challenging ourselves.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. I have to let you go. I want to ask you this, Dawei. Foreign Minister Wang Yi also expressed hopes this time for renewed China-U.S. cooperation on climate change. He said this will bring positive climate change to the bilateral relationship. But I recall back in the Obama administration, the two sides had a very difficult time narrowing their differences and coming together. Will this time be any easier, and considering the political climate in both sides?
I won't say it's easier than the Obama era, but I'll say the climate change is an area that, or maybe one of the areas that China and the U.S. can work together. In the Obama's 8 years, we had a very pretty difficult beginning regarding the climate change, but by the end of the administration, I think the two sides narrowed the gap and helped facilitate the Paris agreement over the climate change. So we can continue our efforts based on the previous efforts made by the two governments, but it's not an easy target. It's not an easy thing to do. Talking about cooperation is of course easy, but climate change is a very big issue. The challenge is this is a very big issue. It's a multilateral process. It's not China-U.S. So many countries working together, right? And also, I think the U.S. or developed worlds, the goal regarding the climate change is changing. So the target is changing. There are some concrete differences and disputes between China and the U.S. or China and the developed world. So those issues need to be handled by the two countries. So it's a process. There are a lot of possibilities, but not easy.
But what are the likely commitments both sides can make? For example, drastically reduction of emission by themselves, or financing the rest of the world to help their climate response, or providing technology?
I think those areas you mentioned are, of course, the two countries can do that. But I will say financing and technology, I think the developed world are more, they are good at that too. While China, as a developing country, I don't think China can do as a developed world in those regards. I think China will more or less focused on itself to reduce its carbon emission. China already announced its goal for the carbon neutrality. I think because China is the largest carbon emitter, so if China can reduce its own carbon emission, I think that will be a great contribution to the whole world. While helping other countries, China can do something, but I will say the developed world have more advantage than China in that regard.
And since you mentioned multilateralism, and climate change is obviously a good example of that, that was also addressed by the foreign minister. He made an interesting remark by saying that building small circles in the name of multilateralism is in fact group politics. So it seems he is implicitly referring to the alliance between the United States and Europe. So what is going to be China's strategy facing the possible alliance and coming together across the Atlantic?
I think China have no problem with the U.S. alliance system. This is a reality. China knows that, and China accepts that. And China is also willing to see more cooperation or better relations between China and the European countries, and between the U.S. and the European countries, and between the U.S. and other countries. The problem is not that. I think the problem is we need authentic multilateralism. So I think multilateralism, I think the essence of the multilateralism is to, on a multilateral platform or mechanism, bind the powerful nations and discourage unilateralism and give a smaller country an equal voice and influence, so they can exercise. I think this is the essence of the multilateralism. So it's part of the democratization of the international relations. It's not one superpower or one major power leads some smaller country, then call it multilateralism. I think this kind of multilateralism is what Foreign Minister Wang Yi said, the group politics, right? I think that's not a real or not authentic multilateralism. So it's another form of unilateralism. So I think here China emphasized the role of the United Nations and the institution under the UN umbrella, and also of course some other widely accepted mechanism. I think we need to focus on those mechanisms that being widely accepted by all the countries, rather than selectively, find some so-called like-minded country or some small circle, and aiming at the other or the third country, the third partner. I think that's not a real multilateralism, I will say.
And the rest of the world probably look forward to China back them up with actions. For example, China's relations with ASEAN. Will that be a peaceful relationship? Will they sign the conduct of parties in the South China Sea, which will provide stability in this part of the world?
I don't know if China and ASEAN can sign the code of conduct this year. Obviously, all the countries are moving toward that direction, but I don't know when can they reach the agreement. But I think here what I want to emphasize is in the process of negotiation, I think the China and ASEAN countries, we are good partners, and I think there are no vital conflicts between all the countries in the region. Yes, China have some territorial dispute with some other neighboring countries, some other claimants on South China Sea, but through the negotiation, I think all the countries, all the claimants has already proved that they have this will to negotiate, to reach an agreement. So I think China-ASEAN relationship will be, generally speaking, stable if the external power won't intervene, it won't utilize the differences between China and the ASEAN countries.
All right, thank you very much, Wei, for your insights.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me.
And you've been watching a special program on Dialogue, Agenda for Progress. I'm Zhu in Beijing. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.